first, get people acquainted with. They may have seen a bottle of Clyde May on their shelves and may be wondering who is this person and how did he get his name on a bottle of whiskey. So, give me a little bit of background on Clyde.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly been a long journey for the brand, but my grandfather, born and raised in rural southeast Alabama, had a somewhat of a difficult childhood and was bound and determined to grow up and provide a better life for his family. Unfortunately, he just lived in a time and a place where seeking higher education or doing things like that was just really not even possible for him. And then so he had to figure out creative ways to provide a more comfortable life for his growing family. Before he did that, it's always worth mentioning Clyde May fought in World War II, Purple Heart recipient, Bronze Star recipient, fought in the Southwest Pacific Theater. Returned home. He had already married my grandmother, but they had 8 children together, so a lot of mouths to feed in rural southeast Alabama. And in addition to a full time day job, in 1946, my grandfather started making moonshine whiskey, and he never sold a legal bottle in his entire life. From 1946 until his death in 1990, never sold a legal bottle. In fact, the only time frame between 46 and 1990 that he wasn't making whiskey illegally is when he was in prison for 8 months for making whiskey illegally. So he had the rap sheet to prove it as well. But he did a lot of things differently. There were a lot of moonshiners in this area, a lot of great products being made, but he was a firm believer that his reputation is attached to anything he does, no matter if it's making whiskey or building birdhouses. It didn't matter. Your reputation is attached to your product. So he did a lot of things differently to help set him apart from his competition. In other words, he let his product do the talking for him. One of the things he did was age a lot of his moonshine into whiskey. And after he died, one of his sons, my uncle Kenny May, started the legal brand that we know today based on Clyde's aged whiskey recipe. And over the course of the last 25 years, we've had a bit of a roller coaster legal history, just like Clyde May had a roller coaster of an illegal history. And it's all led to finally being back home in Troy, Alabama, and opening up this state of the art distillery.
So let's dive into some pieces in this because it's interesting. So talk a little bit about his World War II experience because he was wounded in while he was in
Yes,
service.
yes, he was a leader of a 12-man rifle squad. He joined the U.S. Army. He signed up, like many Americans. As soon as they kind of got the call, they went and fought. He didn't talk about the war too much. He was one of those kind of guys that once he got home, he didn't really talk too much about it. But he did fight in the Southwest Pacific Theater. He was in an infantry known as the Statue of Liberty Division. For those that are history buffs, if you're familiar with Desmond Doss of Hacksaw Ridge fame, Desmond Doss was in that same infantry. Clyde got injured in the battle that took place before Okinawa. So Clyde was shot in his feet, ankles, and shins. So because of that injury, that was one of those types of injuries where he could not continue to fight. So he was sent home and recovered in a hospital. Well, I say sent home, he was sent back to the U.S. and then recovered in a hospital in San Francisco and then was sent home after that. But he received a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star for his service during World War II.
Okay. When he came back here, was he making sugar shine or was he making just a grain based?
Yeah, a lot of moonshine around here, it has sugar in it, but it's still grain based as well. Sugar's part of the process also. But he was a lot of people, when they think of moonshining, they think of corn whiskey. And Clyde May did use corn, no doubt about it, but he was a firm believer in rye and wheat. He felt both of those were flavor grains. So what he was distilling probably would have met a lot of the qualifications to be a bourbon had he done it, the exact, maybe not a straight bourbon because he couldn't age it as long as we do today, but he was a firm believer in rye and wheat. In fact, when he got arrested in 1972, one of the things that they used sort of as evidence against him during his trial were all the 50-pound bags of rye that they found in his barn. And they were like, hey, man, you know, what are you doing with all this? Rye does not grow to any abundance in Southeast Alabama. They kind of had him dead to rights in that regard. When he returned home from the war, he had a background with moonshining because a lot of moonshiners in the area would get, a young man or a younger, teenager to help them when they needed assistance. Clyde was exposed to whiskey making for a good part of his life. But it wasn't until right around 1946 that he kind of set off to do it himself and kind of have his own setup and venture. And it just, over the years, he tweaked things and experimented with things. And it took a while to kind of figure out what he considered the perfect process.
Yeah. Do you think he would have gone legal had he had the option to do so?
Absolutely not. There is no doubt in my mind. He was, like I said earlier, he was in a time and a place where getting a legal license or doing it legally was not something that ever crossed his mind, ever.
Mm,
Distillation of spirits in the state of Alabama was not legal until 2014, and he died in 1990. So you can imagine there was just no thought process there of, hey, I'm going to get, known for it, and then I'm going to go apply for a license. And it was probably even been more difficult since he got arrested and had a rap sheet to go with it. So even if he had wanted to, I'm sure there would have been some level of a legal hiccup to doing so. But if he were alive today, he was also not big about being in the spotlight. He liked to let his product do the talking for him. So I tell people all the time, if he were alive, you and I wouldn't be on this, talking to each other right now. We wouldn't be communicating. He'd be tucked in the woods somewhere, still doing it illegally. I think it took, honestly, his death in order for us to be able to do what we've done to get his name and what he was doing out there, just because he liked to stay out of the limelight, so to speak.
yeah. Interesting that you think about it. If you're going to get started doing something illegally, you're probably going to have a tough time sourcing equipment, especially in a era when, there wasn't necessarily a easy access to still makers. So, but he made his own still, so I understand.
Yes, he did make he just like I mentioned earlier, you kind of learn the process just by trial and error, and he definitely could build his own still towards the back end of his life. It's kind of, you have to, it's a fine line, because if you're building your own still and they know, if the revenuers, federal agents, local sheriff's department, they know you're making whiskey. So it's not something where he could probably make every one of his stills. So it's almost like a balancing act of, okay, I'm going to get someone I trust to build my next still. But then if the eyes of the law are on that guy, then okay, I'm going to build this one. It's just like when you set up a moonshine still, once it gets busted and destroyed. Clyde May got arrested one time, but he probably had 20 or 30 stills get destroyed
Wow.
that were discovered. So, once that one gets destroyed, that's a dead spot. You can't just rebuild in that same spot. You're constantly having to be on the move and on the go. So, similar with building stills, you would build some, and then if you felt like there was too much heat on you, you might need to get someone else to build it for you, someone that he trusted to make it, his specifications, of course. But it's just a balancing act.
Yeah. Did any of those, well, we saw one of those
Yeah.
still. Talk about how you got that still that you have on site.
Yeah, so the county that we grew up in is Bullock County. The county seat is Union Springs, Alabama. That was our address growing up. And Bullock County, sometime in the late '80s, early '90s, decided they were going to open up a museum to tell some of the history of the county. There's a lot of interesting stories and facts about the county. But one of the more prominent and well known things about this area is moonshining. So they said, hey, we're gonna put a moonshine still in our museum. We got to, but we got to get one. So they told the local sheriff's department, hey, next time you find a still, don't destroy it. Just, hack a few holes in the bottom, confiscate it, and bring it to us. So that's what they did. Well, the still they just happened to find next was one of Clyde's stills. And it was unique because it was a still that he designed. He called it the 240 still because there's one particular piece, it's the tank cost about $240 worth of copper to build in the late 50s, early 60s. We call it the Clyde 240 today, but obviously he didn't call it that because you can't really attach your name to something you're doing illegally.
Yeah.
It went to the museum, stayed there for a good amount of time. Museum shut down some years later, sometime around, I don't know the exact date the museum shut down, but sometime around 2011, 12, 13, somewhere in that ballpark. And we, as a May family and as a company, thought that the still was lost forever. Because we had no. But when your last name is May, you can't really go knocking on any doors asking for a moonshine still. They're not going to give it to you. So we just thought it was history. We didn't think anything else of it, and we learned that one of the volunteers at the museum had actually taken the still and putting it in his barn in Bullock County. So once we heard this, I went and met with him, and after a few conversations over the course of a few weeks, I explained to him, hey, we want this still to be able to not only tell the story of Clyde May, but tell the story of moonshining in this area. And I think it's important for us to have that centerpiece to do it with. And moreover, it was Clyde still, and I'm Clyde also. So I think it's time for it to go back to its rightful owners. So he was very kind and donated it back to us. So now it serves as sort of the centerpiece when visitors come to the site. It's right there in the middle of our breezeway in the first building that you walk into.
Nice. It's great to see it kind of come full circle. I
Yeah.
wa- I wonder, how much did you hear about this moonshining legacy when you were growing up? Was it kind of the family secret, or was it just really well known around the community?
Well, technically both. I mean, it's always a secret because Claude May got arrested for making whiskey, but all four of his sons, my dad and my three uncles, have also been arrested at least one time for a whiskey related charge.
Mm,
So, for that reason, it wasn't on a local level. It's not so much a secret.
okay.
Everybody's like, hey, yeah, I know Billy May, which is my dad. I know Billy May's making moonshine and stuff like that. But for me personally, at the same time, when Claude May died, my dad continued to make it illegally. Even as the brand was made legally, the brand was so small for a long time. We always hoped it would get to this point, but it was hard to see that vision gotten to this point, but my dad didn't stop making moonshine illegally until 2013. So to put that in perspective, I was a freshman in college.
Okay.
I'm 31 now. Um, for that, so it's I use that term again, a balancing act. So yes, the locals in this rural area, everybody knows Billy May's making whiskey, but at the same time, when I'm out and about, I'm not out actively saying, "Hey, my dad makes whiskey," So I was quite obsessed with it growing up. Once I discovered and was old enough to know what my dad was doing and what my grandfather had done and what my uncles had done, I became quite obsessed with the idea of this legacy and the quality of making or the what it takes to make a quality whiskey. And when I was a little boy, when I was probably 10, 11, 12 years old, I used to tell my dad, when I grow up, I want to be a moonshiner. I want to be just like you guys. And my mom, who was a school teacher, she hated hearing that. That was something that frustrated her greatly. But that's, when you're the namesake of someone that's such a legendary whiskey maker and you watch your dad make it, and even now, um, that dream has never died. I just plan on breaking the family tradition of getting arrested. I'm just going to do it by the books,
Nice.
pay our taxes and do all that stuff, unlike some of my uh, family members. But yeah, it's crazy. I'm able to openly talk about it now because my dad no longer makes it. My grandfather obviously died, and we have this legal brand. But there was a time in my life where, any information I got or wanted to receive, it had to be done sitting in the living room asking family members, not so much, going out and just asking the public or talking about it in